telling you. You don't know who you are. You don't know what you are. You don't know what kind of a society you live in. You live in a world of lies. Forget about trying to correct your misconceptions about Islam. You have nothing but misconceptions about your own so called civilization. It's not a civilization, it's a hallucination. And it's absolutely comical the extent of your lack of self awareness about your own culture, about your own society. You know, when I lived in the Middle East, I had Americans back home worried for my safety because they thought that every place in the Arab world was nonstop bombs going off, violence and bloodshed all the time. Meanwhile, you've had over 650 mass shootings in America just last year. Not to mention the fact that most of the bombs going off in the Middle East are American bombs being dropped from American warplanes. Whatever violence we have in the Muslim world, you brought to the Muslim world. America's number one export is violence. As a matter of fact, it's one of the only things that you still manufacture over there. It's one of the only things you still excel at better than anyone else. Is Islam a religion of peace? You must be joking. You've dropped 500,000 bombs on us in just the last 25 years and killed over 1 million Muslims in just the last 25 years. That's not even including the current genocide in Gaza that you're committing. Again, this is like the BTK killer wanting someone to assure him that they don't subscribe to violence. What are you even talking about? Your whole society, your whole so-called civilization is violently extremist, more than anyone else has ever been. You love to threaten your enemies with bombing them back to the Stone Age without it ever registering in your mind that this is a Stone Age mentality. The only difference between you and a caveman is that you have gadgets, but you're the land of the free, right? Islam is so strict, it's so rigid, you know. Muslims don't have any freedom. Meanwhile, America has more laws and more regulations than any country on earth. You have more laws and more regulations than Saudi Arabia, more than Afghanistan, more than any Muslim country. You can't even remodel your kitchen in America if you're a homeowner, which you probably aren't. But if you are a homeowner and you have a kitchen and you want to remodel your kitchen, you can't even do that without a permit. You have to get a permit to remodel your own kitchen. Your government decides what food you can eat, what food you're allowed to eat, what food is legal for you to eat. Meanwhile, they allow genetically modified foods, fake foods, foods with all sorts of additives and chemicals and what have you. And a farmer, you know, who grows food on his own land, he's not even allowed to sell food to you right from his land, right from his farm, right out of his crops, fresh, without FDA approval. He even needs government approval to give you an apple from a tree. Your government even decides how hot your shower is allowed to be. It's absurd. But of course, you'll defend all of those laws. You'll defend all of those laws because you'll say they're there to protect you. Okay, if you say so. But you don't have a choice, do you? You don't have the freedom to not follow those rules, do you? We have a comparatively minuscule set of laws, most of which are self-imposed. With no external monitoring, no external enforcement, we follow them by our own conscience. But what you mean by how strict and how rigid we are, what you're talking about is basically all the sins and the debauchery that your government does allow. So that's actually the freedom that you're talking about. You're talking about the freedom to be uncivilized, the freedom to be primitive, the freedom to be hedonistic. And that's what makes you, in your mind, more civilized than us. The freedom to be uncivilized. You think that makes you more civilized. And somehow that makes sense to you. I'm telling you, your society, your so-called civilization is playing you for a fool. They're even fooling you about your own prosperity. I mean, take the United States, the richest country in the world, right? But just look at different states in America. Take a state inside of America, any of the 50 states, and look at it as if it was a country. Look at its GDP, look at its standard of living, look at its quality of life, look at its infrastructure, and so on. Say if you took Mississippi, if Mississippi was a country, or Idaho, or Montana, or New Mexico, or Kentucky, if those states, those American states, if those were countries, well, they'd be equivalent economies. Economically, they'd be equivalent to an Argentina, or to a Colombia, or to Thailand. They would be low to middle income countries. Those American states, they would be low to middle income countries. That's the reality of your life. Most Americans live in conditions, they live in economies within their state that are exactly the same as countries that you would regard as third world countries, as developing countries. That's how you're living in real life. I mean, unless you're among the so-called coastal elites, your state is basically a third world country. And even in those coastal elite states, you know perfectly well that there are cities and neighborhoods inside of those elite states, those rich states. There are cities and neighborhoods that are just as poor as any poor city in the global south. But they've got you thinking that you're better off than people in the developing world. They've got you thinking that you're better off than people in the global south. Why, if most of the states in America were countries, they'd probably be trying to join BRICS. And the same goes for the UK. If you're not living in London, if you're in, say, the north of England, it's the same. It's a third world. You're in the third world. If you're in the north of England, you're in the third world. You're in a developing country. You are deeply and comprehensively misled about your societies, and you still expect Muslims to answer you about anything? You're standing there butt naked in a cowboy hat, telling us that our suit is out of fashion. No, there's no point in trying to make you understand us when you don't even remotely understand yourselves. The whole world has been indulging you, has been indulging the West, and what they want to believe about themselves. We've been indulging you for far too long. It's time for you to start justifying yourself to us. We're not going to pretend that you're in any sort of a position to demand us to justify ourselves to you, when the reality is that no one is, and no one has ever been, as violent, as oppressive, as misogynistic, as restrictive, and as opposed to liberty and to human dignity as Western so-called civilization.